innovations developed from our regional perspectives. And the third one is to add human, technological, and all kinds of resources that will strengthen this perspective. Today, we're having our third session, and I want to let you know that in the previous sessions, all the previous sessions are available in the Charisma Foundation website. And if you want to be up to date in order to get more information on our activities, you can access our website, which is otracienciaabierta.carisma.org.co. Today's topic is climate change and citizen participation beyond data donors. And we have two guests. The first one is going to be Alan Yu, a Brazilian man that, as me, is practicing his wild Portuñol to communicate with his friends from Latin America. Alan is going to give us a presentation on citizen science connecting networks for common knowledge. He has plenty of experience in the coastal region of Brazil in regards of citizen awareness, and he has great interactions, very interesting interactions, in order for us to better think how citizen participation takes place in those initiatives. Alan is a visitor professor in the postgraduate program in the Paraíba National University, and he participates in the University of Lagos, Lab, which is a team of investigation in Brazil, and also the collaboration network for ecological economy and common goods and climate justice with the University of York. We want to thank his participation and his team. So, Alan, you can take over, and after that, I will introduce Francisco for our second intervention today. Thank you very much, Anne. And I am going to be here, go wild with my portuñol. Let me know whether my presentation is already visible. It's a pleasure to be with all of you in this talk in order to share knowledge on the work that we are doing regarding climate change and citizen participation, citizen engagement. I want to tell you about two different projects that we are moving forward. One of them is in Brazil, specifically, which has to do with this logo right here on the lower right-hand side in order to build a Brazilian network of climate change activities. And the second part of the work that we are doing in Los Lagos University, we're working with Francisco Caraus, who is the second guest to this panel. About these two experiences, I want to begin by letting you know about a call that where we are working all from the context of open science and citizen science. And this shape represents an idea that we don't only want to have with open access and open research and open data, but also we want to get people involved in order to promote this kind of dialogue and topics and shared knowledge in order to share knowledge between different actors, among different actors. The general concept that is well known by many is an encounter from people that are interested in different topics and researchers of specific topics as well, in order to do the reach out of information and the co-production of knowledge. Today, there are a couple of citizen science initiatives at global level, well, at the level of Australia, Europe, the United States. And here we have the IPCAP, which is the Ibero-American Participative Science, and we also have the Brazilian one, where there is a parallel collaboration and support to all these initiatives. There is the platform that is called CIBIS, where we have different collaborators for this production of citizen science. And this topic is related to climate change. And I want to highlight the work of the Monitoring Center and the Early Warning for Disasters in Brazil. It is an education program that seeks to involve schools and the learning for this production on climate change in order to prevent disasters or to do early warnings in connection to these disasters. At the level of Brazil, there is the observation and monitoring system of the indigenous Amazon to do this observation alongside with the indigenous communities in that part of the world. More specifically and more recently, I think at the beginnings of this year and the end of the end of last year, there is work that uses this particular application that is called data and tests of water. The idea is to get people involved so that they can build their own data collection. What we find that is significant is the amount of rain. This is very interesting. This kind of work is very interesting that we are sharing from Brazil. And since 2015, since 2014 and 15, we have participated in a project called Open Science Ubatuba. Ubatuba Open Science, led from Sao Paulo, Brazil, to promote open practices and collaborative practices for ancestral knowledge alongside the investigation and the research. And that's where we started working with the group that Anna just presented, and alongside Arida Dagle that continued this project, we began working with this project called CODAP. We're talking about climate change, and we are working day after day with all these organizations in order to indicate these indexes of coastal risks for different communities in the whole coastal zones, but also the inner parts of the countries. And we're talking about a scenario that is ever more frequent and also where greater magnitudes are present. And this kind of threat has to do with extreme climate, such as extreme heat, cyclones, but also other events that we call rising temperature or rising sea levels. This kind of scenario is what we are studying and that we see increasing in frequency, and this impacts the lives of people. The thing that we see from both initiatives is how these impacts affect traditional communities, ancestral traditional communities. We are still in need of more local information data. The measurements of the rise in sea levels and temperature, we need more regional data, more specific data at the regional information at the local scale. in order for us to have information that will help decision making. And there is an ever increasing, ever greater need to communicate this information to the society and to the scientific community. This is a way by this is a means by which people will be making a contribution to science. We are working in this particular place, Brazil, and the south of Chile. These two places. Here we have three communities, three cities, Guarampia, Guarabatuba, and the south of Chile, in order to build and to do training with coastal communities, but mostly traditional communities. So we are working with Mapuches in Chiloé, Kenyan, more specifically, the traditional fishermen in these places. In Brazil, also, we are working with traditional fishermen and Afro descendants, Afro Brazilians who use their knowledge applied to their own culture. So we use an approach with them in order to map the societies and their observations in order to integrate the data that are produced by the official institutions, both in Brazil as in Chile. Part of this work is connected to the endeavors in schools. Pluviometers, for example, low-cost pluviometers, such well made with plastic bottles in order to make handmade pluviometers and to distribute these in a map so this school community can work with their own communities and their surrounding areas. If I see 100 millimeters in 24 hours, what does that actually mean? Because why is it, why are these the data in one place and in another different? What are the levels of risks that happen in different places? So we need to create this awareness as well. Part of this work with schools, we need to work on training at the regional level, geographical level, show them how we can do that overlap, the times of risks at in people's houses, and evacuation routes, for example, are very important. Part of this work is to collaborate the Risk Reduction Disasters Network in Sao Paulo. By doing this part, which is citizen science, and how to use that mapping and how to build learning communities and how schools and the communities can use this information. This was the work, this is the work that we have done so far, and this has been done with the support of the British Council and these universities, both from England and Brazil. We started this work that started with a workshop which is called Traditional Communities Empowerment in the in Brazilian coastal zones to face climate crisis. We use this approach and expand it to work with it in the whole coastal zones of Brazil. The idea was alike to what we did before, working with students, traditional communities, and the usage of reference technologies and digital technologies, bearing in mind planning what we are going to do with this data and to create the training, create an application, but all this information coming from a local society and analyzed together the results of the data. So we have prepared this mapping kit for individuals in the local communities in order to collect data, GPS collecting, questions and interviews to people on climate change, precisely in order to do this gathering of information. And we use this platform, which is called this history map, story map, format, and we link all that together in a platform that I will describe further ahead. It's a platform at the global level that we collect in Chile, for example. We analyzed 7 places in Brazil, which are Pará, Recife, Alagoas, Rio de Janeiro, Bahia, São Paulo, and Santa Catarina. Well, those are 6 different regions at least in order to work with different local communities in our approach. This data collection methodology. What we found is researchers who are individuals that come from universities alongside a local community, working together with these researchers that are here on the right-hand side. Everything bearing in mind the idea that we need to build a network that studies the impacts and adaptation to climate change. One important part of this short-term plan in 4 months of application, we distributed observations in 137 local observations. Open interviews in order to contextualize what was being observed in the field, in the ground. And the result was also linked to a platform that is called Local Indicators of Climate Change Impacts. This is coordinated by the Autonomous University of Barcelona, where we began a collaboration with them. The first important thing was to create this platform and adapt it to the Portuguese language. That's where we started migrating part of this methodology to the platform. At the moment, we are producing this script or screenplay with the communities, with the local communities. Part of this work has to do with the cycle of dialogues with the Lychee project in order to show what can be done at the local level that can be shared at the at global level. Migrating, but not actually migrating, but actually creating new linkage with this observation network of local indicators connected to climate change. As part of this co-op data, we are doing an open migration in order to share, but also do the reach out of how this information can be used both at local and global level. This is a quick presentation, and my conclusion here is like the idea to create this participation with the people. We are working from the perspective of citizen science. We already know a lot about this. Jennifer Sherp, for example, is another person, and the general idea is to get out of this contribution level to a level of co-creation, which is building questions together, questions that make sense to the community, to the academic community. In order to create this, there needs to be spaces for dialogue. This is what these training courses and community work is being studied with this kind of work in order to get out of the mass production, not only dying there, not only staying there, but moving forward in, in a way to make everything more collaborative in order for the as a means of the creation for the discussion here. How can science, citizen science, use for a common knowledge with local communities and traditional communities included? This diagram is an idea from Marianne that includes these several participation groups to create these knowledge spaces, distinct and different knowledges that can be built in order to create a syntax in order to work more in a more collaborative way. N- Near the wrap up, we want to work with autonomy, protagonism, creativity, collaboration, but we also want to find a power because when we're talking about participation, we need to ask these questions: who participates and how do they participate? So we need to go beyond everything that's being done, beyond data collection, and also get people involved as protagonists of these processes, the knowledge production process, and promote this kind of dialogue. Today, we're working with this idea, connecting and collaborating with these knowledge communities and learning communities. There's our communities that have already worked in solidarity, sharing experiences and common knowledge. Well, this is our collaboration network. Is a lot bigger than it looks here, but this is just to give you an idea of what an amazing encounter this is. Amateur scientists and expert scientists who want to share all this knowledge. Well, thank you very much and look forward to your comments. Thank you very much, Alan. Well, I encourage all our guests to include their questions in the chat. The idea is for us to have a shorter presentation in order for us to devote more time to your questions and have a freer dialogue. So now, well, at least I do have two or three questions for Alan, and we are going to go into the second part right now, where we are going to be with Francisco Arauz, who is going to give us a presentation called Community Centrist Investigation and Action for Transformation. Francisco is associate professor of the University of Los Lagos, Chile, investigator from the Center on Regional Development of the Republics, CDU Lagos, and he's the director of the Citizen Science Laboratory of the same House of Studies. Thank you very much, Francisco. Hello, Annie. Thanks for this invitation. Thank you, Alan. Hello, everyone who is joining us from different platforms. I will go through my presentation. I will share my screen, but I also wanted to take this opportunity to mention, well, Annie, I want to expand on what you said, that this kind of science, this open science or citizen science, has a long history in Latin America. In my classes, I try to place ourselves and give the importance of Orlando Falls Borda participative science. There are two very important um, intellectual backgrounds that are a testimony to that trajectory that today has different names, but they come from that very source, that very spring. I understand. I think you are already being, you can now see my screen. My presentation, as Annie mentioned it, and Annie said the title. I'm going to talk a specific
desarrollado
experience
durante
of a work developed
indígenas
in
de
indigenous
la zona sur de
communities
la Patagonia chilena,
of
que
southern
llaman
Chile,
mapuche, huilliche en su mayoría,
Patagonian Chile,
y cómo eso se ha ido
Cuyage,
expandiendo,
Guanichi,
¿no?
these communities, and how this has expanded to other
otros socios.
experiences with
Bueno, ¿cómo
other
nace el proyecto?
social
Y
groups.
esto me parece muy relevante porque en realidad gran parte de
The genesis of this project is
nuestra
relevant because
investigación que
many of
inicia,
our
empieza un
projects
poco
or
con
investigation and action,
con un
they
problema
begin with a
inicial, ¿no?
problem,
Una pregunta de investigación, un problema
either
que en
a
este caso son las
research
personas
question,
que las
but in
personas
this
que habitan en
case,
el territorio
the
donde nosotros
people who live in
trabajamos.
the territories where we
Y bueno,
work
en nuestro
might
caso se
have and might come
relaciona
up with
con
issues. And in
la
our
gran
case,
contaminación ambiental
is
que sufre la zona
related to the
de Chile
serious
en particular,
environmental
producida
pollution
por
in the coast.
una gran industria
This is produced by a
que se
huge
emplazó en el territorio
industry
desde hace
that
más de
has
40 años, que es la
started an enclave there
producción industrial del salmón,
over the
un salmón
40
destinado
years
principalmente a la
producing
exportación
is the
y que
salmon industrial
continuamente,
production,
regularmente, cada 5 o
production and
quizás
export.
menos, está generando
Every
consecuencias ambientales. Y bueno, lo que ustedes pueden ver aquí es un relato de Daniel Canullán, que es un
every
dirigente
time
de la zona de
there are
Meridiano, que es el
different
archipiélago de la Patagonia,
problems with
que menciona
contamination
en
in
ese
the
diario
archipelago of the
en ese
Patagonia.
diario de
In
recién,
that journal,
y
in
habla un poco
that
de un
newspaper,
fenómeno que ocurrió por ahí por el año
there is
2017,
a
donde hubo una
report
gran
of a
mortalidad de
huge
mortalidad,
phenomenon.
muchas
It
toneladas de salmón
was
murieron,
great salmon
se
mortality. There were
generaron,
tons and tons, and they
y
were
en ese
thrown to the
proceso
sea.
se generó una
And
serie de
stemming from
acontecimientos
that process, there
ambientales
were a series of
que se
environmental
produjeron
issues that
meses después
affected the natural
de la
resources, and
descomposición.
afterwards,
Hubo
they
una
created a huge
protesta durante más
social
de 2 meses,
crisis. There were
sobre todo en,
protests for over two
la
months,
mayor isla de este
especially in the
archipiélago,
greatest, in the largest
que
island
hablan
of this
un
archipelago.
poco de cuáles son
And
las
this
respuestas que se
indicates
producen
what
acá, que
the
se
responses of the
relatan
local
en el
groups
proceso de
are and
transformación
how they
ambiental.
respond to these
Bueno,
issues.
y sobre esa base, un poco en ese contexto es que
On that
nosotros
basis and
hacemos
in
una
that
investigación y
context, as
colaboramos
a research
colaboramos
group, as a
investigativamente,
laboratory,
colaborando con la
we
implementación de
research, but we
de una
also
ley que es una
collaborate
ley
with the implementation of a
territorial
law
para
that
poder
actually
defenderse
grants
de la zona
rights,
marina y costera.
territorial rights
Se
for the
relaciona
area, for
básicamente
the
sobre una
marine
suerte de
and coastal
áreas
area,
protegidas administradas
where there are
por
protected
ese grupo
areas administrated,
en ese
managed
proceso,
by
y surgieron una
indigenous
serie de
communities.
demandas de las
There
propias
were a
comunidades
series
para la investigación
of
científica acerca de cómo acelerar
demands
el proceso de implementación
from
de
the
esta ley.
communities
Y sobre
to
esa
the
base
scientific
lo que
community
hicimos
in order to
fue
support
desarrollar y
these
aplicar una
projects.
estrategia de
What we
monitoreo
did was to
permanente
apply a
de las condiciones sociales
participatory
ambientales del
monitoring
territorio, que es
processes
nuestro
for
piloto
the
desde el
conditions,
año
social
2019.
and
Hicimos estos
environmental conditions of the
25
country between
áreas
2019 and 2020 in one of these
a través de la formación
marine
de todos los
indigenous
ciudadanos que
areas,
nosotros llamamos los
or
centinelas
from the
costeros.
uh,
Lo que buscamos también es
training
sensibilizar a
of
la
new
población del
citizens
territorio a
that we
través de una
call
plataforma de datos geoespacial
environment.
participativa, que se las voy a mostrar un poco más adelante, que está en desarrollo, y finalmente contribuir a
And
la
finally, to
conservación
make a
y
contribution
la
to the care
recuperación
and
de
the
este territorio
heritage
ciudadano y el desarrollo de un
by means
sistema
of
abierto
this
de
citizen
alerta
monitoring and
para
an alert system,
avisar o alertar
where there will
cuando
be
hay casos de
alerts
afectación
when there are
socioambiental.
problems that affect
Entonces, un
these
poco también recogimos la
communities.
experiencia de varias iniciativas
Gathering
que
experiences from different
colaboran, que
initiatives,
hacen, por ejemplo,
sister initiatives, I
investigación
would call
de
them,
fauna o de fauna
the
marina,
participation with marine fauna, the fauna, we realized that there was a
siguiendo
need
una
to
metodología
build
lo más
a
simple y
methodology
sencilla
that would be
posible, pero
as
que
simple
permitiese
as
a diferentes
possible,
grupos con
but that
diferentes
would also allow
conocimientos
different groups with different
poder
kinds of
desarrollar
knowledge
un monitoreo
the
participativo a
capability
través de una
of
propuesta
developing
máxima
participatory
de
monitoring
y de algunos protocolos a seguir.
and the inclusion
Lo
of
que
different
se propone
protocols.
una
So what
metodología
we
que
proposed was
basa
a
en unos pilares,
methodology
donde la
divide a
comunidad
fourfold methodology with the
primero
community
luego se
re-
organiza, que es
decides
cuando
on their
se
objectives
define quiénes
and the
van a estar
interests
ahí,
and
establece el grupo de centinelas
these
comunitarios.
the
Luego
community
estos
centers
grupos
are
tienen
decided.
sus propios indicadores y sus
The
propios
community
pasos,
also have its own
cuando se envían
indicators
los
and
registros,
it
se
steps
revisan los
that when the
datos
registries are
y
created and
finalmente
sent
la
to the
divulgación,
laboratories,
que es cuando
and
se
finally the
genera
reach
la
out,
solicitud de
which is
contacto
when
y
the
principalmente a
data
través
is ready
de la
for
persona
the
informática
people
que
to
desarrollamos, que ya
get
está en el
access
aire.
to.
Si ustedes entran la pueden ver, que está en
If
la
you
dirección
join here, you will be able to see it in
www.centinelascomunitarios.cl. Ahí
www.centinelascomunitarios.co.
nosotros ponemos una serie
That's where we
de
propose
dimensiones
a
donde
series
queremos
of
enfocar el uso.
dimensions of our
Nos interesa no solo
territories
las cuestiones
and
ambientales,
marine
sino que también
territories.
las cuestiones sociales. O sea, consideramos que los
We are not
territorios
only
son un
interested
espacio
in
inalterable para
environmental
la
things, but
naturaleza,
also in social things.
donde el
The
ambiente
territories
necesita de
are
una
spaces
constante
for life
interacción. Y
where
esto
social
se
interaction
entiende
is
al
ever
verlo
present.
simplemente, preferimos integrarlo. Entonces, se puede
The
monitorear
idea is to
biodiversidad,
include
se
all
puede
different
monitorear cambio climático, se puede
items.
monitorear amenazas ambientales, se pueden monitorear paisajes naturales
Environmental
y se pueden
threats can
generar
also be
prácticas,
monitored,
prácticas de
different
explotación ilegal del recurso
practices
natural, prácticas de
of certain
reciclaje
kinds of natural
responsable,
resources, communitary
prácticas
practices of
de
collection,
protección ambiental,
harvesting, and so
prácticas
on,
rituales, prácticas
ritual
comunitarias
practices, community
asociadas
practices
al pasatiempo, a
associated
la vida
to
cotidiana.
the
Y
leisure
lo
time
que
and
se establece
community
en esta
life and
dimensión es
histories of
la
social
dimensión vital
memory,
de los grupos humanos en los diversos territorios.
vital
Eso cada una
histories
de
of
ellas
human
tiene
groups in the territories.
descripciones
They all have their own
de la actividad a que
description
nos referimos con cada una de esas
of
dimensiones.
what we
Esto es más o
allude
menos
to with
para hacer una
different things.
ilustración de más o
This is
menos
just
el medio
a
en el cual nosotros trabajamos. Estamos en
graph
Chile, en la Patagonia, un territorio altamente complejo,
that shows
altamente rico
an
en
highly
biodiversidad y
complex
excelente en
territory,
biodiversidad, donde
rich both
pertenece
in
algunos
fauna,
asociados
biodiversity, and
a
social
procesos de
diversity.
recursos naturales y otros también a procesos industriales, como yo les mencionaba, pero
There is
específicamente
also the
nosotros
presence of
trabajamos
industrial
en esta
processes, and it
dimensión.
is in this context that we
Les voy a
are
hablar ahora
working.
específicamente de nuestro primer caso que realizamos,
More
que realizamos
specifically,
en
our
una
first
comunidad que se llama El
case
Mapu,
done
Karel Mapu, en
in a
Mapuche. El Mapu Zungún
community
significa
called
tierra
Karelmapu,
verde.
which means green
Y lo
land
hicimos
in the
con
Pambuche
una
language.
sigla para espacio
And
costero
we
marino
did it.
priorizado
Kempo
en
is
las áreas
the
marinas indígenas protegidas que yo les mencionaba.
ECMPO.
Esto lo realizamos entre abril y
This is the
mayo del
organization
2021
for marine
y fue
areas. This
realizado por
was done in May 2021, done by
una asociación
community,
de comunidades
uh,
indígenas, reúne a cerca de 6 comunidades
indigenous
indígenas,
community
aproximadamente 100
members,
personas.
gathering
Nosotros trabajamos en
150
esta
people
dimensión.
around. We work with five
Se
specific
realizaron
individuals.
aproximadamente 35 reportes
There were
sobre
35
la relación
reports
humana-cambio
on these
social,
dimensions:
ambiental y social
biodiversity,
y cultural.
environmental threats, and
Este es
cultural
un ejemplo
landscape.
de un
This
video
is an
que fue
example of a
enviado por un pescador
video. This was
de
sent
una de las
by a
comunidades que
traditional
resultaba
fisherman
ayudarnos
from one of the
en
communities.
ver.
In his
Se me olvidó decirles,
work, he sent this. I forgot
los
to tell
medios
you
de monitoreo son
that the
teléfonos
monitoring
celulares,
means are cell
grupos de
phones.
mensajería, grupos de WhatsApp,
We
por decirlo
create
así.
WhatsApp groups or
Para crear los
messenger
grupos
groups. In
mandamos
order to
una
create
chat,
groups, we create a
miembros del
chat,
laboratorio participamos
whereas
y las
members
personas
of the
son
laboratory, we
orientadas
participate and
a
people get
mediante una misión
training
a enviarnos una serie
in
de
order to
información sobre el
send
mar
a
y
series
la
of
geolocalización.
data
Lo que les pedimos es una
on what
descripción
they
del
want to
lugar, que puede
sell.
ser
Well, we ask
escrita
them
o
is a
audio,
description that can be
una
either
foto
written or
de la
recorded,
región
audio
que
recorded,
están observando
a
y
picture that
su
shows what
localización
they are
en
observing,
particular,
and
la propia localización que puede
the
ser modificada por la
ear
foto. Esa información
place,
nosotros la sistematizamos, generamos
their
un registro
location.
de cada experiencia y
We
luego
organize all this
pasamos a la
information
plataforma que yo les voy a mostrar. Pero
and
este
we
es un video
send it to the
muy,
platform that I will show you
realmente muy
later.
peculiar.
They send us this kind of thing.
Bueno, no sé si ustedes escucharon el sonido, pero
I
se
don't know
oye
whether
súper
you were
fuerte y
able
luego
to
caracteriza el
hear
sonido del motor de la
at
embarcación
the
al momento
background. What we heard is the
de entrar.
sound, is the noise of
Lo
the
que se me
engine
olvidó el video, pero lo
of
que es
the ship.
interesante, el relato que
He
habla
sent the
de
media, but what he
la ausencia
describes or what
de
he tells us
lóbulos,
is the
que es
absence of
un mamífero marino
seals
muy común en la
that
costa
are
de Chile.
very common
Y
in
la
the
observación
Chilean
que él
coast.
dice sobre
And his
una isla en
observation
el área
is
marina
a place that is
que
in
se
that
llama
particular
Doña
area
Sebastiana. Y
that
dice
is
que
called Doña Sebastiana
se
Island.
conoce como
They
la
said
piedra
this
del lobo,
place is known
el
as
lago del
the
lobo.
Stone
Hace
of the
3 años
Wolf.
estaba llena de lobos
3 years ago, it
y
was
hoy se ve
full of
casi
seals.
ninguno
Right
que
now,
aparece. Dicen que
we
es
don't see
cuando
any of it.
solo los lobos
They
parecen
say
pescar.
that the
Muchas
fishing
veces viene una
boats
lancha de Ancud, que es un grupo cercano,
hunted
a ver las loberas y
these
después
seals in
a
order
entregar
to make baits
material
for
turístico.
fishing.
Entonces es súper
So
interesante ver
this
cómo
is very interesting. It's
la
interesting to
dimensión
see
de la
how
diversidad rural también una
the
memoria
dimensions of
asociada
biodiversity, there is
al
a
tiempo de esta
historic
comunidad.
memory associated with
Hemos
this
hablado
particular
muchísimo acerca
individual's
de la
work.
información
And I'm talking about this particular
la naturaleza
transformation process that nature is going through in this particular
no sabemos de dónde
place.
pueden cruzar o
Well,
pueden
this
estar
particular
bajo
species,
algún tipo de
the
amenaza que estén
seals,
sufriendo, algún tipo de presión.
are the kind of
Ahora,
pressure that they
otro
might
caso
be
también que
undergoing.
nosotros lo hemos seguido haciendo y aquí
This is
se
another
llama un contexto,
case,
esto es una
and
laguna
we do it
cordillerana.
in another
Tenemos
context. This is
tenemos los Andes y la cordillera
Cordillera
de
Lagoon,
relevante, donde existen también comunidades indígenas que
the
habitan esta
mountain
laguna y
range
les pusimos
lagoon, where there are
ese
different
itinerario en este
indigenous
sitio.
communities, and we did a
Aparte de
sentry
que
process up
las
there.
imágenes que ustedes están viendo, las ilustraciones son de un
These
colaborador,
images,
un
these
trabajo colaborativo
illustrations
de Sebastián
are
Paulo,
images from
y
Sebastian
donde
Paulo.
la
This is a
idea es
collaborator,
esta idea del
as a
lenguaje, del
contributor
lenguaje común y después
that
cómo
helps us
trabajar
finding
en
a
conjunto.
common language.
Esto fue realizado entre septiembre de
This
2021 y
was reviewed
febrero
between
de
September 2021 and
2022.
2022, February
Se
2022,
hicieron
with the
20 reportes
community.
aproximadamente y bueno,
There
biodiversidad,
were
leyes
about
ambientales, prácticas
20
y
reports
movimientos
and the
culturales.
threats,
Ellos se autodenominaron como
environmental
Iwikatufi, que es
threats,
algo como los defensores de la laguna Cusrupuyehue, que es el nombre de la
and
laguna en la cual trabajamos.
the advocates for the
Por ejemplo,
lagoon group
estos
was
dos
created.
son dos registros que nos envía
These are two
Víctor Cuchipe
registries sent by Victor
en
Cuchipe
su embarcación, y es interesante
that
porque
who you
la
can see on
imagen
his boat.
que está a mi izquierda muestran un
The
tronco
picture on
típico
the left
por
shows
ahí
a
sencillo,
log,
sin mucha historia, pero
seemingly
que
without a lot of story, but when
indica
he
y nos muestra
tells
muy
us what it
bien cómo
means,
era la
he
navegación en
tells
esta
us
laguna hace
what
40, 30 años atrás.
navigation was in this lagoon 30 or 40
Y
years
está donde
ago,
hoy está
where
ocupado
this
por
area was a lot more populated.
grandes monocultivos
Now there
lecheros
are
para la industria alimentaria.
large
Y bueno, nos
monoculture,
habla un poco de
pine
cómo se ha ido
monoculture for
transformando
the
nuestro
logging
proceso con la
industry.
navegación en bote a
He
través de la
tells us
laguna era
the
común en épocas
boat
pasadas.
navigation was
Ustedes
common
están,
here.
por
The
ejemplo,
people of the
viendo
community travel from one place that is called
Trinidad
Rincon
para
to
tomar
another that is
solamente
called
una
Trinidad
embarcación para ir a la capital, a
in
Osorno,
order to get
o para
transport to
llegar
go to
a
the
las actividades
capital
forestales que existían
or to go to
en los
other
sitios. Se ve
places of
una embarcación
logging
de
works.
madera
In
y
the
una
picture, we see an
embarcación
old,
atracadero, el palo, ese tronco que estaba en la
that
foto anterior, que era utilizado
an old boat.
por don Segundo
That
Cuchipe de
piece
Uquipán,
was actually the piece of
una
log
persona que ya falleció, pero que
used to be part of
honra
the
la
deck.
memoria de su familia y de las personas de la comunidad. Y que nos habla también de cómo ha ido
This
cambiando
tells us
nuestro
about
paisaje
how
en este
the
sitio.
landscape has been transforming in this
Y
area.
para ir cerrando, con estos registros nosotros creamos
Closing
binaculars
to the
para
wrap
medir
up with this
movimiento
registry, we
y
create the
elevamos esta
binnacles, the
información
monitoring binnacles,
a una
and we
plataforma
take this
que
information to a
puede, en el
platform.
cual tenemos video,
Those
pueden
binnacles can
encontrar
be
videos,
found.
carteles
There is the
en el sitio
methodology.
centinelacomunitarios.cl. Y si ustedes entran a cartografía, pueden ver un mapa como
If
este,
you go to
con
mapping,
una
you will find a
versión
map as this
evolucionada de
one,
visualización, pero
where we will
básicamente lo que hace
improve the
es generar un
visualization,
proceso una visualización geoespacial de los diversos registros que se están realizando con la intención de
geospace
poder
visualization of the registers that are
monitorear
being
y
done
vigilar
so that all the
las
processes
diferentes
can
zonas
be
territoriales donde
monitored
trabajamos y
on
donde
these
vamos
territories where
a
we
realizar
work.
esta iniciativa. También al mismo tiempo hemos estado
We
desarrollando
also have
en un
been
proyecto
developing
colaborado del profesor
in
Jaime
the
Husa
framework
una
of
herramienta
our
digital
colleague
para hacer
Jaime Husak,
vigilancia
a
ambiental,
digital
principalmente en
tool
humedales
in
urbanos que se
order
llama
to
Digital,
do
donde crea esos
vigilance,
registros de biodiversidad, pero también
which we
crea
try to
vegetación
all
urbana
create
para
biodiversity
señalar
registries, but
lo
also
urbano solucionando,
make
bueno, el proyecto
denounce environmental
se está
threats in
piloteando
different areas.
en tres humedales urbanos de acá, o sea, humedales costeros de la zona
There
región
are three
metropolitana de Santiago.
wetland
A modo de
spaces that
cierre,
are being monitored here.
lo que nosotros
To
hemos
wrap up,
aprendido
we want to tell you that
y me
what
parece
we
que
have
ese es
learned
el mayor
here,
aprendizaje, es que primero
there are
los
different
ciudadanos
lessons that we have learned
son
here,
protagonistas
and the
y ellos
citizens
deben
are
apoyar
protagonists,
ese
and we need
protagonismo en el
to
cuidado de los
support
territorios,
that
entendiendo
protagonism
esto
in the care of the territories.
estrategias y prácticas
And care needs to be understood as
de
strategies
protección y
and
conservación, más
ample
allá de los
practices
acuerdos
in
internacionales que puedan existir,
conservation and protection
luego que las tecnologías
beyond
sean
the
apropiadas
official ones.
en muchas
After that,
ocasiones para hacer ese
technologies
diagnóstico
needs to be
preciso
appropriate and
de
pertinent
los fenómenos y los procesos sociales a nivel local.
so that social
Luego la
processes and
posibilidad de
everything is included.
que se
After
pueda
that, the
influenciar
possibility that this kind of
políticamente el
information
gobierno sobre
could
los
actually
recursos que
influence
compartir
policy
cómo las
making at
universidades
the
pueden
regional or
legitimar
territorial
información
level.
recogida por
How
los
society
territorios.
can legitimate information that is gathered
El diálogo de
uh,
desarrollo y la integración de
in a
múltiples tecnologías,
participatory way.
eso
There is a
es
dialogue
relevante y
an integration of knowledge. The language is very important. And finally, this idea that knowledge is a common good, and therefore, on the basis of establishing that this knowledge that is commonly generated is very important, how to establish protocols and local agreements for the common use of this data. And I think that's the end. Thank you very much. The links are there available to you, and we will move forward. Thank you. Thank you very much, Francisco. You ended kind of early. You even have a few minutes. I have a question in the chat, and I encourage all our attendees to include their questions. We are all friends, and you can also write. So I'll begin with the first one, the first question that is for Alan, while the others include their questions. The first one is from Indira Angela Luisa. It's Gure, and she tells us, "Excellent, Alan. I wanted to know uh, how I can replicate that pluviometer, and if there is a social traditional technology for the temperature and level of the sea." Thank you very much for the question. Thank you, Indira Izaguirre. She's a colleague who worked with us in this work in the traditional communities in Brazil. She's in Pará, Braganza. Indira, I shared, I've just shared in the chat a link to an education program which is called The Education. The Education. I, I went through it a little quickly, but the idea is that there is a set of participatory activities from the construction. All these, for example, this handcraft pluviometer, but also the knowledge of how the rivers actually work and how the replication of this idea can be done. What we did in Brazil, and in this map, alongside with the teachers, we support and we replicate these ideas, this methodology, to show in the map where these sorts of activities are being done. The construction of handcraft pluviometers can be done, and the APP, the app, the application in the telephone. The individual can be doing his or her own monitoring of the community and can upload data on real time from what is being observed in the rain. We're working with the same ideas of building local groups so that this self-monitoring can be done and replicate these activities. That's it. But to the next question, no, I do not know. I don't have information on that. Where is the question? Temperature and sea levels. Temperature and sea levels.
De la tortuga, tartaruga.
There is a project that I have been discussing with Francisco Arauz in Dos Lagos, is to bring a technology which is called the Sentry tortoise. More than temperature, it also does the measurements of microplastics. This is a multi-sensor idea where there will be multi-monitoring functionality, and also the building of rulers,
Rigo.
measurement devices to measure the levels of rivers, but not the sea. We don't know about the sea. Well, a bit of that technology. So I will share that on the chat. Francisco, do you have
No, yo creo que
suggestions
más que
here?
eso.
No, I think Alan mentioned everything. Okay, great. I do have a question because both of you spoke about data as an instrument for some sort of influence on policy and politics. But then Alan said data for decision making, and Francisco said that there were demands from the community to support the the construction of a law. From your own experience, how does this happen? Are the after all the monitoring and some data systematization, in what kinds of forums happen? Who are the people that join there? And what kind of reception does this data get? Francisco also tells us that one of the roles of the university would be to help validate this data. So I would like to know how it actually happens in reality.
¿Comienzo yo?
Shall I begin?
Ya.
Yes.
Bueno, de diversas formas, yo diría que no hay un
It
canal
happens in
único
different ways. I wouldn't say that
dependiendo del tipo
there is no
de cuál es la dinámica
pre-established
local política,
channel.
¿no?
It
que tiene la
depends
universidad.
on what the local policy, the
Yo diría que
local
hay mecanismos
dynamics are,
formales
where
formales, por ejemplo,
monitoring happens. There are
como
some that are more informal ones.
los ejercicios de
What
monitoreo,
we
en
had
el
is
caso,
among the monitoring
pareciendo
exercises, the first one was,
correcto
it
el
looked like
registro,
an archaeological
y a
site.
partir de ese registro
And
se
from
forman
that
las gestiones y
registry,
contactos
and
con
with
distintos
our own
gobernantes,
contacts with
las instituciones
archaeologists
ministeriales del Consejo Monumental
and the
Nacional,
public institutions in
se
charge of
integran
this area, we
ese
were able
documento,
to
ese registro con
bring this
los
discovery or these registries
apoyan esa
closer to
iniciativa.
people
Y
in
luego,
the
a partir de
institutions
esa
who would
búsqueda,
support these
se
projects.
vio la
From
necesidad
that very
de
phenomenon,
generar algún tipo de formación acerca
the need
de la
for some
arqueología, acerca
training
de sitio arqueológico, y armamos un
came to
webinario
be.
solo sobre
So
eso,
we
destinado a la comunidad
created
inclusive
a webinar
a la escuela local. Eso
dedicated
fue,
for the
digamos,
local school.
informal,
So
no
I
se
think
tomó
that
de
was
manera
sort of
organizada
informal.
como
There
iniciativa.
was no
Y ahí yo diría que hay un
pre-established
camino.
channel,
Y
but it
luego,
worked. And I would say
tengo
that that is
la
one path.
oportunidad, que es
The
la
second one
primordial
is the one that we are
función
presently
de
working on, is the
la
possibility of
universidad, que
establish
al final es la
an alert
metodología. Nosotros
system
presentamos también
of a
en
protected area
en el río Maullín. Lo
in
que queremos
the
proponer
Maoyin
es,
River, for
a
example.
partir de la metodología,
What we want is to use
con la
methodology
metodología, con la
to
participación
go
de
with
investigadores, lo que se
curatorship and the
llama
participation of
alerta temprana,
investigators in order to create an
que
early
inclusive
alert
a
system
partir de
that allows them for the
local.
monitoring
Entonces ahí, en
of
verdad,
certain areas
nuestra labor va a ser
from a
montar
communitary and
los
citizen
protocolos, las metodologías,
monitor
probarlos y
system.
entregárselo de alguna forma a la
And we
gente
want to
de
give
esa
it
comunidad.
to the
Esa es la
actual
teoría,
managers
entregarle digamos, el método armado
and to deliver the
desde
whole
metodólogos
method
que generan la
from
información,
the community that created and
protocolos
generated the
para
information,
verificación de la
protocols
información,
for
y posterior
data verification,
los
and
canales
after
de
that,
comunicación, puede ser
the
canales
communication
de divulgación,
channels.
o puede ser
It
una
would be
denuncia
an
ambiental a
outreach
organizaciones
channel
comunes.
or
Esa es la propuesta para el próximo año, y veremos ahí cómo nos va, pero
an
el
environmental
proyecto es más o menos ese, el diseño.
denounce, for
Así
example,
que, Alan.
and that would be it. Ellen? What I would like to add is that the truth is that the institutions that produce risk vulnerability data, environmental and climate observation, they also have the idea that local information, whatever way they are produced, they need to be validated. So if we are going to use that as a basis for decision making, so they need to be validated. So what I'm saying is that there are plenty of opportunities that we have to work with the local observations. This challenge is deeper on how to demystify the data collection that could be work with validation that is community-based validation. This is an idea of getting together and to give an opportunity to the regular citizen, to the layman, to collect, share information, and share from this, learn from these processes. We need more time to produce this kind of community to learning at the level of at the community level. I would also like to mention this project of education in Brazil. What we want to do is that communities and local communities should produce ever more local data. When regular people would say, I can also make a contribution, what do I do? How do I do that? How can I make a contribution? That is, I would like to go on with this conversation for a long time because indeed I had another question that had to do with data governance. I did not have time to talk about that, but data that co-op data produce alongside the community, they give an idea of the Fern-Kern principles so that the data are easy to find, but with the principles of who produces this data. And it is actually the people who are the owners of those data. In order for that, protocols need to be built. The protocols that Francisco mentioned, there is a series of publications already in place and published on data software rights, what we were mentioning. Because, of course, there is a conflict between what I am producing locally and what sometimes people can produce for specific interests. But that's the point. There is a challenge, but there are ways to move forward. Well, you say care as in care, that data care, data fair, data fair, data care. Is that it? Yes, good. That I think is very interesting. Community data validation. I think is greatly interesting. In your work, we see that roles are exchanged sometimes. When Alan tells us that he has a mapping, a, a community mapping kit, it sounds like a researcher kit because they are actually sharing methodologies and doing research. And when we have community information, these people become innovators, which are two different roles that generally communities, well, the first one, yes, simple data donation, yes. But the second one, there are plenty of projects where there are that include community community councils, community committees. The care has to do with the data that the information should not harm the communities themselves. So that's a very important dimension, the data care. And I had one last question. If the people on the chat, documenting system mentioned by Francisco is very interesting. This WhatsApp, the most accessible tool, the simplest tool, as a photo, as a description, and the location of the particular fact, event, or episode. And after that, there is a lot of work to turn that into a log block in order to build social memory. I think that is greatly interesting because, in general, biodiversity monitoring platforms, the huge ones, really are very objective and they lose they miss that kind of information. They discard, they do away with that. So, that I think There is a lot of work. I would like you to tell more about that data transformation from one platform to the another, because I imagine that all of you are also in the publishing parish. That adds even more work. And I see that their in researchers are also mediators in the research processes. So I would like to hear a little bit about that documents, qualitative and quantitative documentation. That is one of the biggest work. It has to do with keeping that process alive. I would say that the whole initiative doesn't have publishing as its ultimate objective. That's not the first one. The first one is to create interaction spaces with what is being investigated, and maybe we might publish on some other things. Created that research space, and what we have seen is that for the groups that we work with, there is a strong result on the people when we take a look at the same places with a different view. We also got to the idea of WhatsApp mainly from the contact with different experiences. What they use the most is WhatsApp. Well, let's use it as well. Let's use it. This is a learning community. And of course, from when we get registries, we need to be in the process where we are also part of the chats. And in those chats, we participate and we are the moderators and we encourage people to participate. We try to deepen into that information that we get. Sometimes we ask, where is the place? Send us its location or the coordinates, geographical coordinates. And sometimes we have had information about an ancient gold production in a certain beach of a younger person who said that his grandfather used to do it. So you ask them whether his grandfather was still alive, and whether he was alive, we could he could be interviewed. And he sent us this interview with his grandfather, and this is all WhatsApp collected. After that, the systems process that is done in the lab, where we have matrix for these three information categories. And with that, we go through the logbook design and also a dialogue with the different groups that we work with in order to determine what is it that we're going to come up with. This was the first poster that we show some of the information we collect. The logbooks have the same format. After that, there's the third stage, which is the website, where georeference data are uploaded. And then that's where we talk with geographers, with anthropologists, geographers, geologists, engineers as well. And of course, the IT engineers. So there are huge, big teams, and this is a lengthy process. It has taken us up to a year. But because we have that pressure of publishing, we also try that the funds are not the classical research funds, but they should be more flexible research funds, that they should have different times that have nothing to do with the more classical science. Thank you very much, Francisco. The issue of time and the pressure, if there is a different kind of background and different freedom degrees, there is this time for qualitative dialogue in order to create trust links. We've been there in Ubatuba, no doubt. We've seen those processes. I have one last question in order to use our time more wisely. For Francisco, a question on the century. On the citizen century, are the costs very high? Vigilad. Are these maintenance costs very high?
Los obstáculos yo diría que
The
motivacionalmente
main
siempre es difícil, digamos, y hay que estar ahí como
setback
siendo parte del proceso. Uno no puede como entrar y dejar, digamos, que las cosas sucedan sin uno estar presente.
is that you
Probablemente uno,
have
uno
always to
siente
be on top of
el
things.
grado como de
Time is
cercanía
essential.
con las personas. Eso también
So
es un
monitoring,
obstáculo,
permanent
pero
monitoring is
también
necessary.
pone a prueba
This is
como
not necessarily an obstacle,
si
but it
quieres la
also
empatía y los
tests
niveles como de
your
conexión
levels of
social.
empathy and social
Yo diría que
relations.
eso es lo más
I would
complejo,
say that that
porque
is one
ojalá
of the
siempre uno
most complex
tenga que lo haga
things.
en la medida
Because the
en que
idea
se
is
pueda en
that
su vida
people
cotidiana, porque
should
uno
be
le
doing
gusta
this
hacer
alongside
más en
their
general, entonces lo toman como el
daily
paseo del
lives.
fin de semana, que no han hecho y que no iban a hacer nunca,
If an
y
observation to a
muchas veces incluso
wetland is
siguen
going to be done,
jugando
they take it as an outing and they're going to do a picnic or
entonces,
something
yo
like
diría
that.
que
So
uno se los
that is
puede, los
complex.
costos sí
That
son un
is,
poquito altos,
and
pero
the
yo creo
costs,
que cada
yes,
ecosistema
there are
tiene como
high
un
costs,
cierto
but I would
financiamiento
say
de
that as
obligación de
long
hacer
as
eso.
one has a
Eh,
certain amount
no sé
of
cuánto será en dólares, pero el
fine
Vigilife tiene una iniciativa que hicieron
funding,
con un
research
fondo,
funding.
de postdoc,
Vigilife, we did
que
that
tiene
with
muchos
a
postdoc,
fund
y
of
que
one of our colleagues that
para
has a
eso armó el aplicativo
postdocs,
y la
postdocs.
manutención la está desarrollando ahora.
And the
Yo creo que son costos altos
maintenance he's doing it, I wouldn't say that
eh,
those are extremely high
en términos
costs
de la herramienta, digamos.
in terms of the tools
Pero sí son
themselves.
difíciles. Ahora,
Technological
mantener los
tools aren't
equipos
that
es lo
expensive.
más complejo, los
Now,
equipos humanos. Y ahí es donde
keeping
nosotros
the
estamos
teams up,
constantemente
alive, the human
en
teams,
eso,
that's what's hard. That's where we need to find
para sostener otro y así,
funds,
digamos. Yo diría que ese es como lo
funding.
más difícil,
That's
la mantención
that's the hardest part, the maintenance of human teams. Okay, I imagine that Alan agrees. One of the most the really costly thing is the human teams. I want to add that the important thing is time. The time that conflicts with what our academic things is also funding. You and Francisco also mentioned. So this challenge to keep the teams, the human teams together is extremely necessary. This is vital in order for us to be able to produce real results. Those of us who are working with this topic of open science, producing an application is easy. From IT, that is easy, it can be done. The problem is actually to get people involved so that what they are doing makes sense. Well, there needs to be a lot of communication, training, and so on. And there is a need for financial resources. Well, let's hope that this topic of climate change, well, is not going to leave us anytime soon. Let's hope that the funding will accompany us. We don't have any other questions right now. So if you have the last word, maybe the floor is yours. Otherwise, we will stop right here. I want to thank you very much for joining us and tell our attendees that our next session is going to be on the digital humanities, November 24th, the same time. Do you have a last thing to share with us? In fact, I want to thank once more this opportunity to have this conversation with yourselves. Once again, we're meeting and we will continue working. Thank you very much. Thanks for this opportunity to share our
Sí,
work with you.
muchas gracias también a Ani, bueno, a Ana
Thank you very much,
y al
Anne,
equipo que
and
está
the whole
organizando
team that is organizing
los webinarios.
the
Yo
webinars.
diría que el mensaje final es más bien
And we said the final
motivacional,
message is just
así hay diversas
daring.
plataformas, hay
There's a
gratis,
number of
está por último la
free
evolución, si uno quiere
platforms.
usarlo, igual es posible usarlo,
Yes,
digamos, y es gratis, bueno, gratis
there are
entre
different
comillas,
things that
y se puede
are
utilizar
free today that
y
can
ya
be
yo diría
used.
que es como atreverse
And I would say that we need to dare look for these different ways to do science.
Diría que ese es como el mensaje, pasar a la acción.
That would be the message, to jump
Y bueno,
to
eso, muchas gracias
action.
a todos y espero
Thank you
en
very
mi
much.
contacto están los links ahí quien quiere seguir
The
conversando
contacts,
y muchas
links,
gracias.
emails, all contact is in
Muchas
there for those of
gracias,
us who want to have
nos
communication with us. Thank you.
interesa
Thank you
la
very much. It is
serie,
fabulous to be with you.
justamente la serie, la motivación es
And
enseñar que
the
se
motivation of our
puede
series is
hacer,
to
que
teach
que
what
hay
can be done,
solución, que se tiene ya un camino
that there is a
abierto
way, there is a
disponible para
road,
nosotros y
and that
pues nada,
learning with
tengo que
other people is
agradecer.
possible. And this is
Al
nothing
contrario,
that is
este tema nos
actually
apasiona muchísimo y
impossible
es
to
nuestro
understand.
trabajo.
On the contrary,
Muchas gracias
we
y hasta
developed
la
great
próxima.
passion to learn. Thank you very much and see you next time.